I'm wondering if it might be worth having a discussion about the concept of the rule of law as it plays out and what your perspective is on that, being former military, a former police officer especially, and talk a little bit about that as a concept, especially because I feel like when it comes to criminal justice policy, there's always, especially on the right side of the debate, this idea about, we have to respect the rule of law. And that has to be a basic premise, which is not, I think, a premise shared necessarily in the same way by the left side of our discourse. So I don't know if that's a topic or if you wanted to do one of the other ones.
Yeah, and I kind of think that topic would flow naturally as a conversation because it's relatively unexplored in my own mind. And I think that's because I've largely dismissed it. If you're saying from the liberal side, I always find it really weird how I grew up in an environment where you hear that anti-intellectual professors and people who teach or people who can't do kind of zeitgeist where you think that colleges corrupt you into being liberal and being progressive. But what happens is you end up reading literature and you find out facts. And those facts happen to be largely liberal facts. And the rule of law is one of those things. So the presence of a law does not equate in any way, shape, or form. There is no correlation to the presence of a law equaling the following of that law or equaling kind of societal advantage. And if you want to say law and order as a broad concept, you have to always remember that the Nazis didn't do anything illegal in Germany. So the whole idea to me is actually shit. It doesn't work, and it won't work in anywhere else that we know. We go by our culturally accepted norms, and that's why we were saying the criminal justice system says that when we put somebody in a prison, we rehabilitate them. That's the concept on paper. But the actual reality of it is that we want to punish them. And punishment also has no correlation to crime reduction or a societal advantage. So, the only way that laws and enforcement and violence, period, work is in a totalitarian society where, you will get crime reduction, but you're going to get a hell of a lot of freedom reduction. You become, North Korea. North Korea and Singapore aren't rampant in crime, but they're sure as shit rampant in oppression.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so this is definitely for me, I think, a challenging question, right? Because I spent a lot of time talking to people in neighborhoods where something like the murder clearance rate is not ideal. And the truth is, more often than not, when I speak to people, including people who are actively involved sometimes in street economies, they tell me, we want the police getting rid of these murders, man. Do something about these murders and stop worrying about things like drugs or other stuff that doesn't have nearly the same impact, right? So I hear that a lot on the one hand, including from some voices where you're like, oh, I thought you guys were the bad guys, right? Like in terms of how we generally think of them in our society, we don't think of these persons as people with, concerns about their safety. And so on the one hand, I hear that. And on the other, and I also hear a lot of people who say, look, I'm not going to wait 6 months, a year, 2 years if somebody killed my brother and I know who that person is, right? And they feel like the police have a clock on them because they do want that punishment as a result of the crime at issue, especially when that crime is something like killing a loved one or a relative, which is to say that instinct to punish is certainly not absent, right, in these communities that have sort of borne the brunt of what that instinct, how that instinct has played out in our policy historically. And it's to say that instinct is pretty broadly a sort of human phenomenon. And so how do we get to the point where we can convince people that punishing someone is not the best use of our law, right? That the law has to be used to organize society in a way that is effective for the broadest number of people, which I think is a fair way to say in the West. Is whether it's actually played out that way is generally how law has been perceived. Certainly, I think that's fair to say in light of the social contract theory that emerges in the Enlightenment and that informs our own constitutional structure. There's a sense that we create the social contract and the resulting laws in order to create the greatest possible wealth and well-being for the greatest number of people.
Yeah, I get the concept, but like we've talked before about operating in chaos. In our current environment, it changes so rapidly that we live in essential chaos. That's chaos theory. That's like an actual thing. And if you think about it, like book publishers, they thought everything was fine, right? And then we came along with ebooks and Amazon, and it was like, oh no, what happened? Well, they're operating in an environment that has disrupting technologies and chaos. So you don't know the next step. And that's my thing is these social laws, these contracts that you talk about, I think when we try to codify them, we end up in problems because by time we codify them, our environment has changed and our social construct has changed. So we have to be very loose and very adaptive about how we view the entire concept. Like, so right now, we have an abortion debate, right? Well, this is completely far-fetched and it's just a thought experiment. Say we found out scientifically that when the baby comes out of the mother's uterus, then it gains a spirit, like we scientifically proved that, right? Well, then abortion takes an entirely different argument, right? So everything we thought we knew about it would be instantly thrown out the window because of that rapid environmental change that has come through with technology now, and that's ever more so increasing. So I always want to keep us understanding that flexibility is incredibly important. But also, like when you talk about the murder clearance rate and where it is now, in Baltimore, it hovers around 20% currently.
Wow.
But everyone could go back and look at this is a historically low homicide clearance rate. So if the police and the criminal justice system was effective, we would not be at historically low rates of success after 50 years of operating this system. That is complete evidence that what we're doing doesn't work. And what that does is it starts a whole bunch of different cycles. So like the murder clearance is low because police don't have legitimacy. And when police don't have legitimacy, the community doesn't work with them. And if the community can't work with them because they're not a legitimate force or a legitimate arbitrator of the law, then the streets will take to themselves, which causes even more murders and less cooperation. Because if you feel that your only sense of justice can come at your own hands, well, then what do you need the police for at all anyway? And then they become even more of an enemy because they're not helping you with the things that you want them to help you with. You're paying for them to literally come and keep arresting you for these minor offenses because they have an increased police focus because of the murder rate. And society says, well, if you have high murders, then you need more police there. But the police are actually creating the situation that is that cycle that's occurring. Everything, so like our successes in crime have I'm going to argue, come from social sciences and public health. They don't come from policing. We've had crime reductions and we've had better things in our society because of those unwritten and uncodified social contracts. Our codified contract has actually hurt us and thwarted the progress that social scientists and public health officials have been succeeding at this entire time that police have been stealing credit from. New York, we can go into, New York City is a great example of that and how that occurred with Giuliani and broken windows and where the real crime reduction came from, which came from public health. not from anything the police did, yet they get credit for it. The other thing that I see from what you were saying is how the street wants justice and they view it as punishment too. So yeah, that's fine. It's totally fine for individuals to feel the criminal justice system as a punishment for their wrong. It's fine for them to feel that when their daughter gets raped, that they want that guy dead or executed or punished in some way, shape, or form. What's not okay is that global context or that national context that you were talking to our society as a whole, in that we can't go around punishing people because punishment of somebody means that we shame them, and shaming actually is demonstrated to increase recidivism and increase the propensity for crime. So if we put them into a system where we punish them and we shame them, then that person will eventually get out of jail and now has a demonstrable increased propensity to commit crimes than before they went into the criminal justice system at all.
It's interesting because I think this raises the question of when you have a system set up where the laws pursue aims like punishment that guarantee recidivism, isn't then recidivism itself a respect of the rule of law, since that is what the law is inevitably going to produce anyway? Is it fair to talk about the criminal as doing something other than respecting the rule of law by engaging in crime?
Yeah, so you've codified recidivism in your processes, and we have a society that wants to continue to push that. So if you look at this from a management perspective, which is where I'm going to keep taking everything back to, you have metrics and incentives in place to make the criminal justice system continue to expand. So if a police chief wants to make sure, it can be subconscious. So let's just take policing as a whole, not even as an individual, that if criminals come out of jail and you focus on them and you get money and you get paid to focus on that, and the more criminals there are, then the more police you need, the more power you have, the more money you get, the more resources. You've set up a system of metrics and incentives that continue to expand the tyranny and totalitarianism of the police agency as a practice itself. So that's why we see it that way. That's why impoverished communities see it as an occupying force and as something that will continue to expand because they're watching it happen in front of their eyes at ground level. So you said before and pointed out that maybe when we talk to these people, we have to understand that they might not have the resources of education to articulate this in a way that everybody can instantly grasp. But this is what they're trying to articulate, is that they see it. They see the increased occupation. They see the expansion. Because at one point in time, it was the cop walking foot on a call box. Then it became in a car. Then it became only going to problems. Then it became using force and tasers and AKs and AR-15 and doing raids. And then it's MRAPs and it's armored vehicles and it's riot police. It's a continual expansion. It's more surveillance. It's monitoring social media. They're watching that growth system that's inevitable from the way this is literally structured and incentivized to operate.
I mean, I'm curious, this is maybe something of a tangent, but, you've been in the military and you've been in combat. There's an Italian theorist by the last name of Agamben who talks about the nature of sovereignty and the way that the sovereign is both within the law and outside of the law. And, I think as a soldier and maybe to a lesser extent as a police officer, you have been part of those arms of the state that exist at times outside of the law in terms of the way we generally think of that, right? There are things you are authorized to do as a soldier in war that you wouldn't be allowed to do as a citizen, but you're authorized to do both you're permitted in the one case and authorized in the other by the same sort of sets of rules and laws and commitments. So I'm curious about your viewpoint of what it is to talk about the rule of law as someone who's sort of seen the other side of that question of law, that sort of border frontier land where you're sort of imposing the violence necessary to protect the boundary that is our social order.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know if you're going to be surprised by this, but I imagine that some people will be fairly surprised by my answer to that question. So in the military, for one, I didn't see combat. The unit that I was in was a special ops unit that was focused on being so professional and so much of a force that the idea of facing us was not something that we considered realistic. So that's how we operated in our unit, was to, like, when we would do a mission or do something, it would be done with such fluidity and such professionalism that really, I feel as though wherever we were, the concept was already understood that we weren't to be challenged. So that's a kind of a weird position we were in there, that maybe policing tries to do, but isn't quite the avenue for it. Like, they look to the military for a lot of things. But in the military, in the Marine Corps, your rules of engagement are dramatically more restrictive than they are for police officers. You respect foreigners and citizens in a much more dramatic fashion. I never made those connections between military behavior and police behavior like we kind of see in our newspapers and normal talk. I never felt that policing I never felt that the Marine Corps was like this entity that would try to control or would be for oppression or try to not do the right thing. Like, I felt that if in the Marine Corps, I'm completely confident that if one of our guys would have shot a civilian, that we all would have been talking right away. Like, that would have been widely, like, we were so professional, we thought that, like, if we had shot somebody, we would have viewed that as a complete failure of that professional that we were supposed to be.
I'm curious, let me just ask, especially because the topic, we're talking about rule of law, how much of that has to do with the fact that the military has, right? I mean, I'm sure there might be those listeners who feel like, the military commits abuses all the time, or there certainly have been stories, say, out of Iraq and Afghanistan of instances where soldiers did things that we consider reprehensible. But the military has in place, I think, a largely respected system of criminal justice to address violations of things like the rules of engagement, for example, or any aspect of military rules. Whereas it does tend to seem like in our nation's police forces that the accountability mechanisms are severely tilted in the direction of non-accountability. I mean, how much does that sense of professionalism, how much of it is informed by the fact that there is a working, viable system of justice within the military in a way that there doesn't seem to exist for police?
Yeah, I mean, I also don't see that, and maybe there's something in the literature that will kind of support that in some way. And I'm speaking very anecdotally and personally here, but I never thought about the laws in the Marine Corps. I never thought about what the rules were. I couldn't tell you any of the rules of conduct or anything like that at all. I couldn't tell you one. But what I knew in the Marine Corps was this feeling of esprit de corps, where you were loyal to the overall concept of making sure the Marine Corps was a respected thing as a whole, that your actions would affect every other Marine. And like, I felt that if you operated with integrity in the Marine Corps, and I could be completely wrong, but I felt like if you were trying to do the right thing and operated with that integrity, then everything would be fine. Like, you weren't going to get railroaded. Nobody was going to turn on you. There wasn't going to be some dramatic result. If you made a mistake and it was an honest mistake, and you could discuss those mistakes, and everything would be done to try and fix those things. And I never felt like there was ever an effort to try and enact punitive measures. That was in the Marine Corps. The idea of getting court-martialed is like the very, very last resort. It's almost more of a community policing model where all the enforcers are expected to try and find all these other solutions to the problem before you get to that point.
Is that facilitated by the fact that obviously in a military system of justice, you are being held accountable to the military, right? You are not in that situation being held accountable necessarily to the civilians who live in this foreign theater of war in which you have been asked to operate as an American soldier. Whereas police...
No, I have to stop you because, like, as a Marine, you're... like, the mentality didn't have anything to do with representing. It almost felt like you were representing humanity. Like you owed a cost to those. Like you would never do anything ignorant or rude or whatever to a civilian in a foreign land or an American citizen. Even more so an American citizen, because there was this idea that is who you're serving. And your actions represent the country as a whole. Your actions represent the Marine Corps and the person next to you. It is not that no soldier or Marine at any point in time is serving the nation or the Marine Corps, but there is a representation that you will affect other Marines and and other Americans, and you see your Marines and Americans as a whole as your brothers and sisters who you don't want to embarrass. That's who you fight for. You fight for the person next to you. You never fight for the war. There's nobody in Vietnam that was fighting because they believed in Vietnam. They were all fighting to protect that soldier next to them. And like, that's what I think where the positives from the military actually come in. And it's not in that codified system. I've been in arguments a lot lately with the general idea that if we would imprison or find our officers guilty for these transgressions and for these use of force and killings, that we would see less of them. And there's just no reason to believe that anywhere that these punishments or laws actually are what is truly the success. They only seem to work as a last resort.
It's interesting you mention that because it kind of takes us back full circle, because there's this tendency, I think, to look at, especially for those who are, say, on the left side of our political spectrum, to look at, say, abusive policing and some of the criminal justice policies that, to the minds of many, drive that, like nonviolent drug offenses, for example, and say, this punitive approach doesn't work. It has created the problem of mass incarceration with all of its incumbent social consequences, but then to look at police and say what they need is more punishment, right? Is to say, and we, so we make this really bizarre argument where on one side punishment is the cause of all the problems, and on the other side punishment is the solution to addressing those problems. And so in talking about the problem of punishment and its relationship to the rule of law, I mean, how do we move away from this where we continue to think about the rule of law largely in terms of punishment only for the other side? Well,
see, like even the idea of punishment, just like as a blanket idea of meaning anything is a fallacious concept. So in anything that involves human studies, any kind of social sciences, there's going to be detailed and complex nuance to everything. So not only is like prohibition of drugs and prohibition of guns two entirely separate arguments, like everything about them on an individual level requires nuance for each particular case that goes on. We like to do false things like prohibition is bad, and that's dumb. Prohibition is not bad. It requires nuance. It will fit in some situations and not in others. And even punishment, like punishment can be okay in certain situations, but it requires a lot of nuance to make that a thing. So let's just say, like, if I had a choice to spend 6 months in jail or have 40 lashes, I may take 40 lashes, which is purely punitive in its concept, but I wouldn't do that again. So that would be rehabilitative, and we can move on from there. So it would require nuance even for the individual who is involved at all. But when we're talking about, like, the whole concept of punishment is completely off. So even if we say, like, we're going to punish police officers, so or we want to convict them of these crimes of murdering an innocent civilian or somebody that wasn't doing anything, the problem is for our criminal justice system to be rehabilitative and to work, we need to say, what was this crime? What are the conditions of this crime? And how do we prevent this crime from occurring again? What marks rehabilitation? Because the reason we imprison people has to be changed to be viewed as imprisonment. That physical confinement is only to protect the rest of society. It is not to entrap that person like an animal. So we kind of have to, like, the idea of a cage may be wrong. It just has to be physical confinement to keep them from society, but we will put them in solitary thinking that it's a punishment, right? But there's no reason why you couldn't give somebody an entire acre of a field out in the middle of nowhere where they can move around and do whatever. You could even do it for cheaper, but we are stuck in that punishment idea. We have to be set into an idea where they'll be better when they get out, and so that crime never is committed again. So a police officer who operates with state-sanctioned authority to kill somebody, if we take all of our variables and we put them on the table, then what is the variable that led to this officer killing somebody during a car stop? Here's the big moral conundrum. All we have to do is eliminate the fact that they're a police officer.
Yeah.
How do we move past that? I mean, think about that. So, like, if we were actually being empathetic and looking for solutions, then that person just wasn't cut out to be a cop. So the whole concept we have is entirely focused on punishment when it comes to police. And punishing a crime simply does not work in preventing the next crime. But if we look at solutions and how to fix the solution, so that individual wasn't cop material. So why wasn't that individual police material? We'll make sure that that scenario never occurs again.
But I guess the issue is, right, if we're still thinking largely in punitive terms, then the truth is, what we have to be willing to acknowledge to ourselves is that that police officer shooting or killing the motorist is exactly what we asked them to do because we come from this punitive perspective where we view quote-unquote antisocial or illegal behavior as something that needs to be remediated through force. You know, and so just as a police officer, is it fair to say that the message you're hearing is you need to go out and punish people, not make society better or keep us safe per se?
Yeah, so the idea is that transmission, and you hear it in colloquialisms. So we the laws, we just enforce them. Well, that's a morally corrupt position. So we have put our police officers as a society, and that makes us accept a morally corrupt position of just following the laws and punishing people. So you don't think that you're necessarily punishing the person. I think in policing, the idea for a generalization is that you're following the law. The people made the law via the politician, so therefore this is what the people want, tying back to your logic. But I would fundamentally argue that those laws don't come from the people, and that's where that fallacious connection comes in.
And, you know, then just going back to the overarching theme, rule of law, is it fair to accept or expect people to abide by laws that yield almost no benefit for them, or that are structured in a way where it seems like their only role is to be on the underside of the law?
Well, they don't. I mean, so that's the thing, is that the laws don't do that. The law is literally not a disincentive. I mean, in certain cases, we can argue that maybe it lowers its propensity or it increases the equation of when you will actually commit that offense.
Mm.
But the biggest offense in all of human accepted society would be murder. And I think we can all envision a scenario where we could justify us murdering somebody. So that law is not a barrier.
Interesting.
I mean, it literally never is. All they can do is move that bar a little bit to where you're willing to do it. So, like, drug dealing is bad, but nobody woke up being like, damn, if I could be anything, I want to grow up to be a drug dealer in the corner of Penn and North.
Yeah.
Nobody. So something happened that made them be in a situation where breaking that law was not worth or wasn't enough of a deterrent or factor or whatever to what they needed to get to survive. So your Pavlov's, or is that Pavlov's hierarchy? Yeah, it's Pavlov's hierarchy. Where you get all those needs, well, that's just, I mean, you're going to fill those needs, basic human needs, before you ever address a law. So now if you have all your basic needs, you're completely fed, you have everything you need, well, then we start to follow laws more so. But I'm going to argue that we're not actually following those laws. We are just in a situation where we don't have anything to gain by breaking the law, so why would you do it anyway?